Good morning, everyone. How are you all? It is lovely to see you on this gorgeous London morning. We've just poured water, but I have to say no one on the panel finds it hot here and finds it quite strange, the way that Londoners are all responding to the weather. But it's good to have you with us today. Welcome to our discussion on unlocking Africa's potential in critical raw materials. Now, we all know that CRMs are the backbone of the all-important shift to a low-carbon and digital economy. We also all know that the potential in Africa is absolutely staggering. And I'm really looking forward today to delving into all of these issues with our panel. But I want this to be a session that really comes to life, that we deliver for you. I really want your input. So what you'll see up there is Slido. Have you all got Slido open on your devices? Do you know how to do it? Open the app and enter the code there. You can use the QR code to access this, and then 2201242 is the PIN. What can be a bit confusing is you also have to go on Slido to the actual room that we're in. You choose the session. It's the red session, and it's called Critical Raw Materials. So in order to get your questions to me, you just need to enter that room in Slido, and then throughout the panel, I'll be bringing in your questions. So please do send them to me. If you'd rather make a point or you'd like to ask your person in question, there'll be roving microphones in the room, so just raise your hand and we will make sure we come to you. So please don't be shy. I would love to hear from you. We'd love to get your questions throughout the session. I wanted to get our brains into gear, though, so I've got a couple of questions for you to start off with as well. Can you answer for me this question? Roughly how much of sub-Saharan Africa's mineral potential is unexplored? A, 10 to 20%, B, 30 to 40%, C, 50 to 60%, D, 70 to 80%. Now, can you open up your Slido and put your answers to that question? And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce you to our fantastic panel that we have today. We have Robert Yildirim, founder and chairman and CEO of Corex Holding. We have Giuseppe Foglia, VP M&A Sustainable Raw Materials at Stellantis. Kwaku Awotwi, who is chairman of the board, United Bank for Africa in Ghana. And then Salma Sataru, who is a director of listed mining companies, but also the founder and CEO of Cashew Coast. So a great panel for you. Have you all put your answers in? Let's see if we can reveal what the correct answer is. There we go. Look, a lot of you have guessed 10 to 20%, 30 to 40%. You can see what you're putting in there. And the correct answer is, that's right, 70 to 80%. So that is how much of sub-Saharan Africa's mineral potential is unexplored. Well done. Gives you an idea of the huge potential that we are going to be discussing today. Before we get underway, though, I would like to introduce Heike Harmgaard, who is Managing Director of Sub-Saharan Africa at the EBRD, just to bring us some opening remarks.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. And it's great to see such a great interest, given in particular what we just learned now, but also very good to see many of you, again, on the panel, existing clients, new clients, but also everyone interested in supporting sustainable critical raw materials and how we can all work together for the benefits of also our new EBRD shareholders from the continent. So we are already welcoming Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, and Nigeria as shareholders, and Kenya, Senegal, and Ghana to follow soon. So we are really looking forward to help and understand the massive potential and how EBRD, with our experience in other regions, can support critical raw materials. So we have an extensive experience supporting resource governance, transparency, best practices across the mining sector, which I think is really instrumental in realizing the benefit and to attract investors globally, domestically, and regionally into the sector. And as we've already heard on our introductory kickoff remarks, it is crucial for the low carbon pathway and the local value chains to help us transition to a low-carbon economy. And so Africa really holds the key for the world to transition to a low-carbon economy with these resources. And we want to be part of helping and supporting companies and governments in this sector. We have an experience that provides a strong foundation and to really support the strategic mining sector. And we see, of course, Senegal, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana with huge potential. And I think in particular, recent numerous licenses that have been issued for critical raw materials in 2024, and we're also supporting, in addition to investments, also technical assistance to helping getting the best value for money for the countries and also for the private sector. I mean, if I give you just a few recent examples, Uzbekistan, we did the mining sector policy reform where we helped the government to modernize its policy and approach, prepare a new subsoil law and implement that approach that was just passed this year on the 2nd of February. And I think we also have very effective ways of working with governments where they see us as investors. We invested in a silver mine in Morocco, but also help them to support health and safety rules in the mining sector that are internationally recognized now that will hopefully attract even more private sector investments. To give more examples, Mongolia, Ukraine, EBRD helped develop digitalized geoscience databases for the mapping and digitalization of existing structure and integrating them into databases. So I think we really offer a holistic way, and I think it's going to be interesting in the panel to see what are the key areas where, you know, a development organization that has a number of heads as an investor to the private sector, an investor in critical government infrastructure, but also someone who helps on the policy side to bring everything together, can really help unlock some of this massive 70 to 80% underutilized resources in Africa on critical minerals. So we enter really sub-Saharan Africa with an understanding on the risk, the opportunities in mining, and we want to work closely with the private sector, with the government, and all players to benefit the experience and promote investments on the continent that are not only commercially viable, but socially equitable and environmentally sustainable. So super excited about this panel today to setting the stage for, you know, this new chapter. And today is a big day for Africa and the EBRD because already 3 countries will be approved as countries of operation today: Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Benin. And so hopefully with the others soon to come. But it's a big day for Sub-Saharan Africa for the EBRD, and we hope this is going to be a big sector for us to work together. Thank you so much.
Heike, thank you. Thank you, Heike. When I was researching this, one of the figures that really struck me was that Africa holds more than 30% of the world's mineral reserves. As Heike was saying, there are remarkable opportunities here, but we're also at this pivotal moment, a chance to create value on the continent, not just extract it, and to support inclusive and sustainable growth. And one of the things we've talked about that we'd really like to challenge you on and challenge the panel on today is some of the big questions around value, addition, governance, transparency, infrastructure, and skills. And we're going to try and get to the nub of it, what we need to do to seize the moment right now. What role can governments play, the private sector, multilateral development banks play to turn all of this opportunity that we can all clearly see into prosperity? And how do we make sure as well that Africa is not just part of the supply chain, but a central actor in shaping its future? So before I come to the panel, I do have another question for you. Take a look at this one. Which part of the world processes the most raw materials from Africa? A, African countries, B, the European Union, C, the USA, and D, China. While you're inputting your answers there, I'm going to ask Kweku if you could answer a question for me. Why is it that we still see so much of Africa's mineral wealth being exported in its raw form?
Well, good morning, everybody. You know, Africa's mining patterns have really been unchanged for the last 100 years. And it's only in the last perhaps 20 to 30 that we're really now saying, how do we get real value out of our minerals? And if we haven't been processing for the last 80 years, it means we're only now thinking about these things.
And I suppose you weren't surprised. the panel definitely weren't surprised because I asked them before what the correct answer to the poll is. Let's see your live answers, what you've managed to input for this particular question. Which part of the world processes the most raw materials from Africa? And you're all exactly right. The correct answer is D, China. No surprise from the panel, I guess, that that's the correct answer. No, absolutely. So let's get into it. What needs to change then, Kweku, in terms of infrastructure, politics, how commerce operates, to keep some of this value in country?
So I'd cite 4 broad themes that probably most of you are familiar with, and maybe cite a few examples. So political stability is obviously a sine qua non. A lot of places where you have a lot of artisanal mining, for instance, there's no security. And if you want to provide commercial mining operations, you need security. And that's just a simple example. And Nigeria is a very good example of that. That's one idea. I'm not even talking about, the government. I'm just talking general stability, the rule of law, being able to bring your people in and out, being able to bring your goods in and out, services in and out. I would cite macroeconomic stability and ability of, again, predictability. We talk about, especially foreign exchange, being able to be brought in and taken out. Broad economic stability is very important for commercial mining. I would say infrastructure is critical. And if you go to a lot of African countries, what you'll find is the infrastructure that is in place today was in place 50 years ago and hasn't changed. And if you're going to produce large amounts of, you name it, bauxite, iron, nickel, manganese, you have to significantly upgrade your infrastructure. Ghana, for instance, is in the middle of trying to upgrade its bauxite mining tenfold, but its railroad is what it was 50 years ago. So infrastructure is critical. And finally, I would say, and probably the most important, regulatory stability, predictability, and ability for investors to come in. And for many, many years, that just has not been in place. What we see on the continent, especially now as it relates to critical minerals, is that African countries are realizing that they have to really upgrade their old mining codes to be fit for purpose. And again, I'll go back to Ghana, which is the country I'm most familiar with. In 1986, Ghana was in the middle of an economic decline, and gold production was probably less than 600,000 ounces. And it completely upgraded its mining code, allowed for foreign investment, forex abilities, et cetera, et cetera. Today, Ghana is producing 5 million ounces of gold, is the continent's largest producer of gold because of those changes. And what we see in many countries today, whether it's DRC, whether it's Nigeria even, Guinea, all these countries are upgrading their mining codes because what they have is really old and has not been really fit for purpose all these years. And if you don't have that regulatory upgrade and fit for purpose, you won't get the benefits that you're looking for.
Robert, in terms of your very personal experiences and some of the challenges that have just been raised there, you've been a long-standing partner of the EBRD, mining investments across Turkey, Central Asia, the Balkans, now Africa. You've got this new company, CoreX, really focused on international mining as well. What challenges are you really facing when you're trying to expand into Africa?
Well, like Kweku said, the rule of law is very important in Africa. Unfortunately, it's not there, so the financial institutes are hesitating to finance the greenfield project. So most of the investors are looking for security and then infrastructure. Labor is in there, but quality of labor is not there in order to add the value added. So most of the raw materials are forced to export to the developed countries to get processed. Like China heading the whole world, and India is aggressively coming. Unfortunately, Europe and US is way behind. So that's why we as a COREX saw the next chapter is coming, and Africa will be the future. Everywhere I say Europe is yesterday, Asia is today, Africa is tomorrow. So we are investing to tomorrow, today.
But in terms of those challenges you've just outlined, how do you begin to navigate?
Well, you have to build relationship starting with the government and explain them what you want to do and what are the missing items, and we need to get them involved somehow, at least bureaucracy side, getting the permits for the not only operating the mine, but also the infrastructures like railroads is problem.
So navigating all of that regulatory framework must be quite tricky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you need to go after that, convince the banks and investors. Thanks God, EBRD finally is in Africa and focusing on the sub-Sahara. So this is a golden opportunity for us to team up to bring some of the critical mineral resources to the West, because China has no problem, because China is just one body, the government, so they finance everything and they take everything. But the West was pretty much sleeping, now is waking, but we need to decouple the situation in Africa between the China and the EU and US. Okay. So today Trump is very strongly talking about critical mineral, railroads, all these. So all of them are in Africa, but we don't see any US companies are coming and investing, only talk. So it's better maybe EBRD together with IFC and Africa Development Bank and some other institutes, local banks, they all team up to get attention of the EU and the US heavily come. And we as a third country, I'm from Turkey, so we have a excellent experience in the Central Asia, Latin America, and now we are bringing all in Africa, so we can bring our experience and the know-how, but we need to have access to capital to discover the values in Africa. So great decision by EBRD to come and help us, and we can do the good things.
You've caused some smiles in the front row here. I'm pleased to hear that. Giuseppe, can I ask you about Stellantis? Really, really racing to secure critical raw materials. I mean, this is fundamental, right? You've got to diversify your supplier base. In the African context, what are your top priorities at the moment when it comes to sourcing and investing in CRMs?
Well, in Africa as well as in any other part of the world, we have the three key priorities. One is to secure long-term access to critical raw material. The second one is to create a robust and cost-transparent supply chain. And the third one is the ESG. It's last but not least, it's important for us to track all the ESG along the supply chain. It's clear that, as mentioned by Kweku and by Robert, there are some risks that we have to deal with. Geopolitical stability, regulatory unpredictability, infrastructure gaps, ESG itself. But it's something that we see, let's say, the light. There is something moving.
But of all of those, what's your biggest concern? You just listed a few of the worries.
Well, I should say geopolitical stability and also the infrastructure gap tied with the ESG. Yeah, I think these three are so important in order to unlock the the potential, because we need to see Africa as not only as a resource pit, but as a key strategic player for the world itself.
Salma, tell us about your journey, because there's lots of parts to it, from building up Cashew Coast to your work across the mining sector. I think we need to kind of introduce you and what you've done first before I chuck a question at you.
Well, very good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and representing female leadership in the mining sector. I've spent the better part of 16 years working in mining finance, and then in 2018 I decided I wanted to see more processing in the continent that raised me. So I set out to set my agribusiness venture, which I'm now running successfully from Côte d'Ivoire. So I've moved from mining into agribusiness because I wanted to see more processing on the continent.
Okay.
In my lifetime.
And what is the right tool, in your view, with this really unique perspective that you bring to the situation, that could drive local processing?
I think when we talk about local processing, obviously we talk about resource nationalism. And there is a tension, whether resource nationalism can actually bring about more processing on the continent. And resource nationalism resonates doubly with me as an African entrepreneur who's actually invested into more processing happening on the continent, but also as a mining professional that sits on boards acting for foreign direct investors. So, I've worked on indigenization transactions in Zimbabwe. I sit on the board of a company in Niger that has its license revoked only a few months ago. I also sit on a large gold company that has sold one of its assets in Burkina Faso. So when it comes to resource nationalism, I don't think we should be too judgmental. I think it's a sovereign state's right to assert its control on its resources. But on the other hand, the means by which this assertion happens is what we need to look at. Because I think behind resource nationalism, it's about capturing more value in Africa. The means by which we get there has to be thought about, because as Kweku rightly said, mining is about capital intensity. It's about attracting foreign direct investment to invest in infrastructure, to invest into capex, to develop those large projects. So what does Africa need to do? And it's a very complex question, and I don't pretend I'll be able to answer it within a couple of minutes. But I do think that we shouldn't be doing more of the same, but we should be doing less of something different. And by that I mean, look at the existing structures today, right? We know that junior exploration mining takes 10 years, at times 15 years, to actually develop a mine, right? Out of exploration, investments, etc. Whilst that happens, typically government has a free carried interest that's sitting there, right? And that is not generating anything. And that causes a lot of frustration, typically in country, because the mine is not being developed, and that's the end by which income will be created in the country. So what needs to be thought about is financial understanding of how mining stock markets work. Because the investors in these junior mining companies are actually making money during that period. But the state, the governments are not seeing that. So it's about building that local competence to understand how financial markets work and participating into that, rather than nationalizing and expropriating, which actually gets capital flight.
Gregor, can I ask your view on resource nationalism and what you've just heard? The suggestion there is that it's a bit controversial.
Sure. There are a couple of extremes on that, right? You can, take over somebody's mine and say it's yours because the reserves in the country are yours. I don't believe that's appropriate. There's a lot of risk capital that folks invest in, and I think rightfully those people should get those return on their investment. On the other hand, I think the model that a lot of African countries have used so far has not really taken advantage of what the resources are. And many, many times what happens is that countries are just happy with their royalties, a corporate tax rate, and they actually don't use the money themselves, I'm talking about African countries now, to develop the communities in which mining is actually being produced. And that goes across the board. You take any African country, there are very few. Ghana has been producing gold for 100 years, and we ask ourselves, how come Boise doesn't look like Johannesburg or San Francisco. There are very good reasons for that have to do with linkages into the economy, et cetera, et cetera. That's one extreme as well. So I certainly don't agree. I don't disagree with some in terms of rethinking how our laws have, provided investment and generated jobs and sort of the development of our local economies. And I do think that there's a middle ground, but I wouldn't necessarily sort of believe in outright, let's take over these reserves because they sit on our land. I don't believe that.
We have had a couple of questions already. Thank you so much, all of you, for getting in touch with me on Slido, and it's really great to see your questions. And they're on this, Selma, so I'm going to put them to you for a bit more of an expansion on how all of this potential can be developed in a sustainable way, making sure local populations share the benefit without bearing all of the environmental costs. And a follow-up to that as well from someone else in the audience. Since the talk is largely about African minerals, how do we ensure the people of Africa benefit from the resources underneath them? You've already alluded to some of the solutions, but just on those 2 points.
I think it's about inclusion, and we've seen how inclusion has impacted boards, including women on boards, including diverse candidates on boards, and that has come through legislation. And I do think that the way we can make sure that the people of Africa are actually benefiting is actually working from the ground up. For instance,
and
local
where is that happening? It's women on boards and quotas and things.
Well, it's happening globally, right? But for me, empowering the people of Africa, let's call it very broadly because it's a continent, it's not a country, it's about ensuring that local content laws actually become effective, right? It's about working from the ground up. It's about ensuring local suppliers are actually getting a chance to tender on mining projects, right? So what I've seen, my experiences, I went on a mine site not too long ago, and the canteen was run by an expat company, right? That doesn't make sense, right? Common sense would dictate that if you want a social license to operate, then you have to work with local suppliers and have local employees as part of your staff. It starts with very simple things like that, to empower Africans in their own homes. So I would think that the local content regulation that we're seeing in West Africa at the moment is positive because it's acting as a catalyst for more inclusion of African employees, African suppliers, and building that satellite economy around mining. That's much needed.
Robert, we've got a few questions
so Lucy,
asking.
I have a great anecdote for Selma on female leadership and inclusion.
Yes.
And also it speaks to the opportunities around beneficiation.
Yes.
So there's some lawyers that I work with in Nigeria who have started a conference called Gold Gemstone in Nigeria, and some of you may or may not be familiar with it. In 2022, it's called Women in Mining. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They set up a conference in Lagos on gold and gemstones, and they had, let's say, 20 stalls and very few people coming in. And today it's 3 or 4 times that, and includes 34 African countries. But the point about that is that when they started and they approached artisanal miners and people who actually work on this, nobody was registered officially. And when they told the folks to come and exhibit their wares, they didn't want to come because they were illegal. So the point there really is that, in terms of inclusion, there are women who are actually leading the charge in some of these areas because they're less confrontational, perhaps, because they look for more constructive ways to get things done. But they're also seeing the opportunities available to them in beneficiation.
And just, Giuseppe, I wanted to bring you in. How does Stellantis see this beneficiation process? I mean, there's obviously co-investing and local processing and things that you're doing as well, but you're extracting raw materials. What are the opportunities that you see for actually building value on the continent as well, and is that important to you?
Well, as a Stellantis, we usually take a portfolio approach. We try to get direct off-take agreement as well as a co-investment agreement. I think that finding a local partner is the key. We need to have a local contribution from players that are in the country. We let's say, in return can bring help and support also in know-how, in technology, but a crucial step also for any other business that we have done in Africa, independently from critical raw material, we'll see a local presence, a strong local presence that helped us to, let's say, improve our operation in order to make our operation viable.
You've had a successful copper investment in Argentina, though, with partnerships there. So can you bring some of that experience that you had in Argentina? Does it translate? What worked there to really make these partnerships flourish?
Well, I see some connection for sure. As we said, the let's say enhancement of the local need, local viability. Let's say working with the local player, finding stakeholder in the country. I see this as a strong connection also with Africa, because it's important, as we said, we talk about operational viability, that we take care from upstream to downstream. It's not just a question of investing in a mine and that's it. For us, that we are the end user, it's important also in view of tracking our ESG to have as much as the supply chain concentrated and located in the country in which we decided to operate. So that's for sure a similarity, and I think can be applied. It's important to really join forces among all the players. We need a sort of blended finance program in order to ensure that this could happen and not to waste the momentum. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get more on that in a bit, but I wanted to bring you in again, Robert, with a really specific example, because you're all asking for that. In Ivory Coast, you've got this new nickel project. What's your experience been like with that so far?
We are new. It's our first mining investment in Ivory Coast. We bought the existing mining operation, and we are trying to improve the operation. And unfortunately, a lot of things are wrong. We need to invest on the capex side and infrastructure side, and we need to prepare nearby the port some storage area in order to make the shipments more effective. And port, San Pedro port in Ivory Coast, having difficulties. Port is not doing well, so we're now considering maybe acquire the port in order to integrate mine and the port, and we are working together with the local logistic companies, helping them. So we are just building our local community relationship. Government of Ivory Coast is 30% of our shareholder in the project. So it will be, it's like a sort of public-private partnership type project, and we are considering to expand it now. We are negotiating another greenfield to expand, and nickel is critical mineral, and my company Corex is focusing on the nickel side, even though many big mining companies are exiting from nickel because margins are very slim, small.
Robert, there's actually a question here. Profits in nickel and copper processing are plummeting. Is recommending greater investment in African mineral processing wise, given the market conditions?
Well, as I said, China is price setter, and they dominate the market, and Indonesia and the New Caledonia, and if you add the Russia, Norilsk Nickel together, they're around 80% of the world, controlled by the mainly Russians and Chinese, mainly Chinese. So the West is becoming unsecure in the supply side. So I created my company's strategy to be the reliable supplier to the West and decouple the West and East in the nickel. Recently, Anglo-America sold the nickel asset to Chinese. I was in that tender. It was strange, weird things. And the South 32 exiting, Vale is exiting, all from nickel. And we are trying to invest in those assets in Latin America mainly, and looking at the assets in Tanzania now, nickel. And so we are going to build one of the biggest nickel mining and ferronickel producing company in the world, and tie together with the end users in the US and Europe. So that is something that we built a sort of attractive story in our storybook to make a revolution.
What you're describing in Ivory Coast, though, is very much a mixed picture in terms of the opportunities but also the challenges. And I'd like perhaps the two of you at the end to answer this question that we've received in from our audience. Could you give us an example of a mining success story? Financial but also sustainability, community benefits and broader economic impact. Salma, maybe.
I can certainly talk about the mining company I sit on, which is a really interesting story because its DNA is in Latin America. So it started in Peru. The founding team is actually Peruvian. And they developed mines in Latin America, and then they acquired a portfolio of mines in West Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire namely, and they successfully developed a mine in Séguéla in Côte d'Ivoire. And I thought that was really interesting in how this Latin American expertise kind of migrated into West Africa. And I think that's also the opportunity here with the EBRD moving into SSA, right? Because I'm saying you guys, but I'm saying the EBRD comes from that track record of success in Eastern Europe and understanding emerging economies. And I think when you come from that perspective, investing in SSA, and I think Robert probably comes from that pedigree as well, you take a different approach. So I would really use the mine, Séguéla's mine of Fortuna, as an example of success, of integration with the community, and also a nationwide program about impact. So I agree that mines should invest in their local communities, 100%, but also I think mining companies have to invest on national programs to improve their image and their reputation.
Do you have a good example as well you could share?
Sure, I do. I mean, I worked for Ashanti Goldfields for a number of years, but 20 years ago. And while I was there, we built two mines, one in Tanzania, the Geita mine, and another one in Guinea, in Siguri. And, you know, one of the things we understood, actually picking up from what Salma said, is a lot of historical practice was that, you know, foreign companies would come in and all the proceeds would go outside of the country. And we really paid attention to the community and building up the community. I remember, you know, in both places, Tanzania and Guinea, we really paid attention to the social programs that we had to put in place. We put in microfinance funds. We built infrastructure for health and education. And it was critical in our view to support and build up a community that actually supported the mine and not the other way around. I remember when we built the Tanzania mine in 2001, 2002, HIV incidence was over 50%. We spent a lot of time looking at ARV, how do we bring those incidents down? Obviously, it was in our self-interest, but it also created a much healthier community and workforce, and we spent a lot of time thinking about that. I mean, today, Geita is one of the largest gold-producing mines in the country. And even though, you know, today it's about critical minerals, I think there are lessons learned from old practice as well.
Can I ask, this is, I think, particularly one for you, Robert, that's come in. Can Western mining companies compete with Chinese companies on an even playing field?
In China, I mean, in Africa, yes. Right now, things in Africa change. China was so aggressive 20 years ago, and they were bringing big money, billions of dollars, donate to government and get the infrastructure tenders, building the roads and power lines, but taking all the nature resources, and then Africa found out they're not gaining anything because they bring all the Chinese workers and everything. So now Chinese are pretty much unwanted in Africa, but who's going to replace the China in there? That's the big question. For that reason, we are focusing in Africa, and we can compete with Chinese because we culturally fit in Africa better than the Chinese, cultural-wise. And then treating the people, and once we have access to capital, because the China has huge capital, and once it's solved, I believe that we can do better than Chinese. And then the more the government programs starts for infrastructures, especially the power, because the cost of power is expensive. Once it goes to the single-digit levels, which is starting now, and a lot of renewable energy, and rail. I was in Washington, D.C. a couple months ago. They were considering, like, to Angola, put $400 million to new railroad, and putting the ports to take the minerals out. So the U.S. is considering now. EU is considering now. Once those comes, I think the West can compete with China easily in Africa.
Okay. Well, while we look at keeping tax revenue now, and how do we keep that on the continent, I have a question for you, so get your devices out and see if you can answer this for me. What share of tax revenue comes from mining in sub-Saharan Africa's most resource-rich economies? The panel got this one straight away. Let's see if you do. A, less than 5%, B, around 15%, C, around 30%, D, more than 45%. Now, let's not give the answer away in case there are some in the audience who are pondering this. But you were suggesting to me that things are changing on this front.
Yes, I don't want to do any spoilers. But yeah, there is winds of change blowing across West Africa, particularly when it comes, as I said earlier, local content laws, rethinking how mining conventions are being signed, at what rate. All of that is happening as we speak, and it's very, very topical because obviously Côte d'Ivoire has just only recently opened the country for mining. It's been traditionally an agriculturally led economy. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how the economy of Côte d'Ivoire evolves from now on.
Okay, well, have you all inputted your answers? Let's see what you thought. What share of tax revenue comes from mining in sub-Saharan Africa's most resource-rich economies? And everybody out there, you're very clever. That is right. A, less than 5% is the correct answer. That is quite staggering, isn't it, Kweku? But you're not surprised. You got that straight away when I asked you.
Yeah, sadly so, sadly so. But what you're finding in the critical mineral space is that countries are looking at their current historical sort of tax policies and actually upping the game for critical minerals. I guess the sense is that they are more desired, they're needed, there's competition around the world for them. So, again, picking a particular example, there's a lithium mine being approved in the Ghana parliament as we speak, and their whole tax regime is higher than the current historical rates.
Are there any countries at the moment that you think are being overlooked, or any minerals even that are being overlooked that you could reference?
Well, if you say that, 30% of the minerals are held in Africa, that are sort of Africa holds 30% of all minerals and 70% is unexplored and undeveloped, you could probably look at any country in Africa and say these are potential areas. But I would myself cite a couple. I think Nigeria in particular is an interesting example because, for years and years, all they've done is look at oil and gas, but they actually have everything. And what they need to do is work on the things that, concern most investors as rule of law, stability, macroeconomic stability, etc. But they are making changes in their mining code. For instance, a couple of years ago, they separated out, I think mining and oil and gas were the same, or they have a separate mining ministry for mining. And so they do recognize, and they are allocating budgets for solid minerals exploitation. And there's a lot of potential there, and they're slowly moving from that illegal mining to legal mining. They're slowly providing security for folks who want to do commercial mining. I think there's a lot of it's a completely unexplored and undeveloped country from that point of view. I think Guinea is another good example, even though it's under a military regime. What I would say for those who know anything about you look at a country like Guinea, and you take Ghana, for instance. Whatever Ghana has, Guinea has 7 times, whether it's hydro, gold, iron, bauxite, you name it. And again, they are now putting in a lot. They're regularizing their mining codes. They're doing new surveys, and they're really spending a lot more time thinking about how do we make our country attractive for investment. And of course, DRC is your typical example. And they have so much. But even they are really recognizing that they need stability, they need macroeconomic certainty, and they're upgrading their mining codes as well. You see a lot of countries in Africa upgrading their mining codes, and I think that's always that's one of the key markers in terms of these folks getting ready to open themselves up.
Giuseppe, can we return to something that we've touched on a bit, which is about risk? I mean, we've talked about the challenges and the risks as well, both the geopolitical, the operational risks that seem to exist, and Robert was talking about his experience in the Ivory Coast. How do you strike that balance? How do you deal with risk? Because you obviously need long-term certainty, but these risks exist.
Yeah, well, it's not easy. As said at the beginning, one of the key points will be to have cooperation and partnership with other players. Both on risk mitigation tool, for which with a player like EBRD, for example, we can work in order to study something, design something that could help, for example, in currency hedging, that is really for first loss exposure. So mitigate all these risks, it's absolutely not easy, but we believe that one of the key drivers will be the cooperation between a different pool of investors, a different pool of stakeholders. We need more coordination. We think that with enough coordination among the players that could be involved in the country, we can mitigate a lot of this potential risk.
There's a very specific question here, though, but it's relevant, I think, to what is happening, about the current geopolitical situation in some countries when it comes to security. How do you deal with that? How does that complicate things, Giuseppe?
Well, the security of the country, one of the first binary KPI that we analyze when we have to decide if to go or not go. As I said, not properly easy to, let's say, to address this. Let's say from a financial perspective, we have some tool in order to address this. For example, if we identify an interesting project, even in a country in which there is a geopolitical risk, we could decide to, let's say, to approach in that investment with a phased controlled deployment of capital. So that is tied to the achievement of milestone, but these are just, let's say, compensation. Maybe we need something to work something, let's say, on top. We need to work upstream in order to solve this kind of issue. And for sure, the cooperation within the local player, the local government, the local partner is crucial.
Anything else to add from the rest of you on that particular issue? Great.
I mean, I think political stability and security is paramount, and without it. But I mean, there's almost a balance between that and resource nationalism. You see the countries in the Sahel sort of taking over their resources. Let's just again, I do think that many African countries are. It's not hard to see the opportunity being presented by the current energy transition and the digital transition. And you see that many African countries want to be ready for that. And so they are willing to do whatever it takes to be part of that supply chain. I think those of you who follow the news, I mean, the DRC reached out to the U.S. not so long ago to see whether they could create some kind of mineral deal with them so that they could create some stability around the M23 in Rwanda. So that's just one example of how do I use my minerals to provide stability in a region where I have a lot of minerals. And I mentioned Nigeria as well. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, the country I follow a bit, you see that the government is putting military police in all the areas they have mining concessions, something that didn't happen 5 years ago. And so you see this as a trend, and I don't think it's going to go away.
Does anyone have any questions in the audience that they'd like to raise or an experience they'd like to share? Yes. We'll just wait. We've got a microphone coming your way.
Thank you so much. Now, we touched upon many interesting points. I think one that was touched upon, Robert, was also about the tight margins that we see in the mining sector. Specifically, you made the example of nickel. We also talked about how much Western countries want to diversify their imports. And we also talked about how much the market is concentrated. So the question is, are Western companies or countries willing to pay a premium to diversify their imports and how that will also help, in theory, African countries?
Well, nobody wants to pay premium, obviously, but he's the end user. Giuseppe says they want the ESG top, but with the free. In Africa, security, you pay extra money. Logistics are most expensive logistic in the world because of infrastructures, all this. So when the product comes to the world market, there is a price set by the buyers. So putting the premium is almost impossible. So when you are not setting the prices and you have to control your cost. So we go to Africa to improve the cost of production and reduce the, especially in the logistics side, because mining costs are pretty much everywhere in the world same, okay? But logistic is unbelievably expensive, ports are expensive. So once we do that side, Africa will be very competitive and the margins will go up automatically. But going to your suppliers, like they want security, if they want long-term secure supplier, reliable products, then they have to learn how to give premium. China never pays this, but Europe and US pays a little bit. They cannot pay too much because they need to compete with China. The other day I was reading a news, China is dumping steel slabs to now to Europe. The price of steel slab are less than the scrap price. So why you go buy the scrap, melt it and make the slab? You buy from China. So that is the game changer. No one can pay the premium. Only is the security purpose, quality purpose some.
But if I may, I think the idea of premium is dynamic. So when mines, tender for things, and they tender for them for the first time with companies who've never done business in Africa, that premium is high. But as they supply and do business and understand the logistics pathways to provide those things, those premiums come down, and they continue to come down until they, let's say, they meet world parity. Doesn't happen right away, but it happens. And so when you find in tenders, people who've never done business in Africa, they can't compete. But if you've been doing business 10, 15, 20 years, you find that actually I can navigate those premiums.
As we come to the end, I do have one final question for you. There are as many options as you'd like on this one. That is not a hint, I'm just letting you know. And the question is, which of the following can mining operations bring to a country? A, increased electricity capacity. B, increased government revenue. C, skills development and training, and D, improved governance. So you can pick more than one. No hint there, but you can. And while you consider that and we start to wrap up, Selma, you know, you have brought this unique perspective to the panel. Of everything that you've heard today, what do you think is the most hopeful thing about what's happening on the continent?
I think the human capital in Africa. You know, we are the fastest growing when it comes to youth, and we see how the population is dwindling and aging in the rest of the world, even compared to China, to Asia. So I think what gives me hope is the human capital and the investment African governments need to make in that human capital, so that we can understand the world we're operating better.
For you, Kweku, the hope.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Giuseppe, hope?
Well, for me, for sure, political momentum. We see, as Kweku mentioned, there are some bold leadership that are helping in growing the potential in Africa, but also the global industry shift. No? There is a recognition outside in the world about the importance of Africa in the overall strategy for raw materials. So I think these two.
Robert, what gives you hope?
Well, I would say things will start change eventually, because Africa is the only continent is going to make the tremendous growth and has a more potential. And it makes sense to make the vertical integration in Africa instead of carrying the goods from Africa to the other continents. You can save that transportation cost and processing things and do much cheaper in Africa if this electricity capacity is increased, cost goes down, and the governments are helping to the investors. And most important is the infrastructures. So that must be done by the either government bodies or like the IFC, EIB, EBRD, Africa Development Bank. Those institutions must put some money together with the private companies to provide the cheaper electricity, cheaper infrastructures, and then the investment will come Africa instead of shipping to China to process. So the process, it's possible, and we discussed yesterday with Kweku, the banks are getting more knowledgeable and willing to finance the investment to Africa. So I think that Africa is the future.
Africa is the future, a great way to end, but let's bring the answer to this final question. Which of the following can mining operations bring to a country, and see what your thoughts were? Skills development and training, increase government revenue, increase electricity capacity, improve governance. Actually, the correct answer is a very hopeful thing. All of the above. So the correct answer is E, all of the above.
You're cheating.
Yeah, there was a small cheat at the end. But a really hopeful way to end the session. Thank you to our panellists for the powerful insights that we've heard today. So clear that unlocking Africa's potential in critical raw materials requires more than investment. As we've heard today, innovation, partnership and trust are some of the things that came out of the session. And I thank you all very much for your contributions as well. Thank you all for being here today.